Welcome to a new SAP S/4HANA Cloud Knowledge Snippet. Again today we'll be staying on the topic of advanced variant configuration. Now in the last recording we looked at how you can improve the user interface and the user experience for your internal users, your sales order entry people. And today, in this snippet, we'll be looking at how you can improve that kind of experience with your external-facing business partners, your customers. And to illustrate the context of what we're going to be doing today, let's look at one such sales order. So when you configure a sales order, and again, we're taking our MacBook Pro as an example, you can see that we have evaluated a certain number of characteristics. But if we go to the default group, we can see that we also have a certain number of other characteristics which are not open for input. And these are essentially characteristics that are used more for internal purposes to either record variant pricing conditions or maybe update certain values from characteristics, or in this case here, I'm concatenating different characteristic values into another characteristic. And the effect that this has is that it will be apparent when we look at the document, the sales order confirmation that is sent to your customers. So if we look at the sales order confirmation of this particular sales order, one of the traits of configurable materials is that all of the characteristics are printed on the sales order confirmation. Now that's, I think, a really neat feature. But the issue that you can see here is that all of the characteristics that have been evaluated, i.e. all the characteristics that hold a value, are going to appear on the sales order confirmation. And it could be that there are certain characteristic values that either I don't want the customer to see because the added value is close to zero, or in some cases it could be that it is going to simply be duplicating information. If we look at the additional software characteristic, we can see that the customer selected Final Cut Pro as well as Logic Pro. And then we have another characteristic that I use for internal purposes that is called Final Cut Pro installed yes, Logic Pro installed yes. And then we have these two characteristic values here for variant conditions which have absolutely no value to the customer. So the idea is that you don't want to have your customers getting these sales order confirmations and questioning some of these values that they see in there, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with the order. But there is going to be names and values that appear here that potentially a customer is going to question and say, well, is that what I ordered? So it's going to be a waste of time for him to contact you asking for clarifications. It's going to be a waste of time for you as well, providing those clarifications to your customers. So the best thing to do really is to be able to limit the characteristics that are printed on the sales order confirmation form, so that the customer just sees what is pertinent to his order and what it is that you want him to see. So this is what we'll be looking at in this particular knowledge snippet. How can we influence the characteristics that are presented on the sales order confirmation form? And also potentially we'll add another feature, which is that we want to also potentially sort these characteristics in a particular manner. So let's dive right in and see how we can do that. So the way to do that is via Inapp extensibility, and therefore, for that, we go to the custom fields and logic application. So there is a baddie that exists that you can leverage to perform exactly what we're trying to do. So let's go to the custom logic tab directly. And we're going to be adding this code to this baddie. And the business context that you're looking for is, if I can remember it, it's PLM variant configuration for print. So then we are going to be using the characteristic filtering for printing. Baddie will give the baddie implementation a name, and we'll say chart selection as an example. So let's go ahead and create this. Now, as with most of the baddies that are provided in cloud, there is some example business logic that is presented to kind of give you an idea or pointers on how you might want to leverage this particular baddie and adapt it to your particular needs. Now, out of the demo example coding that is provided, you'll see that there is this particular section, which is really where all the magic happens. And essentially what happens in this particular loop is that the system will go through the characteristics that are associated with the configuration profile of the material that is being configured. And in this particular loop, it determines whether the characteristic is print relevant. In other words, do I need to show it up on the order forms, or do I dismiss it and not print it? So in this particular case here, the determination is based on the first character of the characteristic. And in this demo code, what it does is it looks at the characteristic name, and if the first letter of that characteristic begins with P, then it essentially determines that to be a printable characteristic. Now, you don't have to do the same thing, of course, but what I find important as a takeaway here, which kind of also provides a nice segue into the importance of having a clear strategy and vision up front in terms of how you are going to be naming your various objects. In other words, what is the naming convention that you are going to be using to name your classes, your characteristics, your dependencies, and so on and so forth. Because you can't just dive head first in there and create a characteristic with a name that kind of smells like the option that you're trying to configure. You need to look at the environment, you need to look at the context, you need to look at the application of this characteristic, the use of this application, and to kind of give you maybe an example on a project where I was working very recently, what we did was for all of the product related characteristics that were important for a sales order entry person to have visibility over, we somewhere in the naming convention provided the letters PRD as in product related, but we've also created a number of characteristics that we are using purely for internal purposes to store the results of calculations or further processing within the configurable material. And for those characteristics, we've called them INT. So the simple fact that they include the string INT as an internal. So already by the fact that they have this string, it allows us to exclude those characteristics from being printed. Okay, so again, nice segue. Think about how you are going to be wanting to name your characteristics. So now we'll just adapt this particular code to the context of the MacBook Pro that we have. So I'm going to try and do this without changing too much of the code for the sake of speed. And of course, whatever code I'm going to put in there is just for illustrative purposes. You'll need to look at exactly what kind of code it is that you want or what works for you in the most optimal way yourselves. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to adapt so I'm going to say the material number NS, and you can obviously Google the about keyword documentation to understand what the NS means. So in the loop at characteristics, now in this particular example, all my characteristics are called PRE and B Pro something, so they all begin with the letter P, which is not really going to be great in the sense that if I keep the code as it is there, all my characteristics are going to get printed, and what I really want to do is just limit what gets printed to one or two characteristics. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of that, and what we're going to do is we're going to say if the characteristics are equal to let's quickly check. Let's go back to the configuration profile and we'll look at the names of those characteristics, and we'll just pick a couple. We'll pick the processor, for example, and the graphic card. So I'm just going to quickly again switch on the both so that we can see both the technical name and the English, so the language dependent name of this characteristics, and we'll print just the processor and the graphics card. So I'm just going to say that I want to put the processor in there, and what we'll do is we'll say or, so that we have both characteristics in there. So I'm just going to say so let's go for PRE graphics. So we'll put that in there as well. And seeing as we've got the OR statement, I'll just also put a third one in there, and we'll just leave it at that. So out of all the characteristics that are evaluated, we just want to print those three. So the processor, the graphic card, and the storage. So let me update the name of the characteristic, and we'll put a full stop. We'll align all of our code to be neatly aligned. So essentially the system is going to go through all of the characteristics of my product, which are all of the ones that are shown here, as well as the default group. And in the logic, it'll say, okay, if the name of the characteristic is this or that, then we keep them by saying print relevant to true. And if the name is different to those ones, it'll just put them as print relevant to false, excuse me, and hence it's not going to print them at all. And then, like I said, the next thing that we can also do, or actually maybe before we move on to doing a sort, let's just try and test our logic. So let's go, and also actually what we can do is you can add a filter. So if we go to the body documentation and look at the body documentation, you can actually also put a filter for where this filtering is going to happen, because these characteristics could be printed on a sales order confirmation, so a sales document. They could also be printed on a purchase order if you are going to be ordering a configurable or a variant on a purchase order, and also on the engineering production engineering documentation, where you might also there say that you want to filter it or not. Now for, I'm not using either of these other two applications, but just in case, I'm going to say that I only want this to be for sales. So we'll add a filter as well. So let's add a filter, printing application equals, and we'll put the value sales as it was in the body documentation. So let's go back to available fields and put in some values in here just to kind of test. So product configuration, if we look at the code, is going to be, so LV Matenaire, so that's the material number, product configuration, that's going to be the name of my product, so PREMB Pro. The object database, that's material, so it's going to be Mara. Configuration profile name is PREMB Pro. And we'll just say OK to those values. Now, the other things that I want to do is, if my class had a characteristics, you know, they would, which one would get printed or not. So we'll just try for a couple. So we'll say, if one characteristic is called PREMB processor, so I'm going to put that in the characteristic name. I'm going to add another characteristic. I'm going to call it blah blah. And we'll put also storage. Add another one. So essentially what I want to do by putting in these values is not the processor, I've already put that in there. We'll go for storage. So essentially what we want to do is we want to test our logic and say, well, if I had a configurable material that was going to have the characteristics here assigned to it, so one called PRE-MB Pro processor, another one called blah blah, and then PRE-MB Pro storage, which of these ones are going to be selected as print relevant? Now, if my code is okay, then I should hopefully just see these two come up. So processor and storage should be selected as print relevant, and blah blah should be not selected as print relevant because it doesn't equate to one of the characteristic names that I've indicated here. So let's go ahead and test this particular logic. So of course we'll have the logic down at the bottom. And what we can see here is that yep, so of course I can directly see what the problem is, which is that the system is interpreting this closed parentheses as part of my characteristic name, which is of course wrong. So let's go ahead and update the characteristic name here by removing the parentheses. I again do save draft, and if we test the logic again, we should have two characteristics coming up. There we go. So we now have the processor, and we also have the storage characteristic that have been deemed as print relevant as per my logic, and the characteristic that is called blah blah has been excluded because it wasn't part of my print relevant equals ABAP true logic. Now the next thing, or the last thing that I want to show you that you can do if you wanted to, is to then also sort the internal table characteristics. It could be something as simple as ascending or descending based on the characteristic name. Now the internal ID I don't think is super relevant for sorting because simply the way in which you create them, it's going to be the number is going to be internally assigned, and of course the number is going to be assigned based on the order of creation, which I don't really control, and I of course control more the name of the characteristics. So what I can, for example, do is I can ask to sort these three characteristics that I'm going to have by the descending order of the characteristic name. So we'll just put a last piece of logic in there, and we'll just say sort, and we are going to be sorting the table characteristics by, and these are the parameters of the internal table. So we have the table characteristics, and then we have internal ID and characteristic. So I'm just going to say that I want to sort this internal table by characteristic, and we're going to say descending, put a full stop in there. So let's do a quick save draft. And what we're going to do is we are going to now just before I publish my logic, what I want to do is so we can do a bit of a before and after comparison. I want to call up the order confirmation that we had previously created, and then we'll create a new sales order and we'll do side-by-side comparison to see which characteristics get printed on the order confirmation form. So this is the old version, and you can see that all the characteristics that have been evaluated are printed. Let's go back to the custom logic. I'm going to publish my code. Yep, that's what I want to do. So let's say OK. So it should take a couple of seconds. There we go. So my logic is now published. I go back. I could have my fourth object coming up as well as the filter. So clearly telling me that it's the application is sales. And let's go back here and create a new sales order for the same material, same combination, and we'll then go and look at the sales order confirmation form to see what shows up this time. Let's pick this, so we'll call this test number 2. PREMB Pro, quantity of 1, and I'll do exactly the same as the other order, so I'll try and evaluate as many characteristics as possible, but of course we just want to see 3 coming up, so I'm just going to say country, we'll pick Angola, we're going to say yes to both pieces of logic installed, and if we go and look at the default group, we can see that we have a fair few other characteristics that have also been evaluated. So I'm just going to say done. To go back to the main screen, confirm the ATP check. Confirm the ATP check. Here we go. And if I now go to the header output preview, and once again look at the PDF document, probably doing a little bit of compilation, and there you go. Now we can see that we've gone from all of these characteristics being printed on the sales order confirmation form to just having those 3 characteristics printed. And you can see that we've also done a sort, a descending sort of the characteristic name, and so yeah. So now the customer just sees the information that is pertinent to his order, the only information that is of real added value to him. And I think we've achieved what we wanted to. So we're giving the customer the information that he wants, that he needs, no more, no less, and helps us to expedite a sales order rather quickly. So there you go. I hope this was useful, and stay tuned for more. Please do like our content, share it with your colleagues and network, and subscribe for more. Thank you.